First of all, what an honor to be on stage with the both of you, and I'm very excited to have this discussion. What I wanted to start with first is just to open it up with a question about the emergence of consciousness. When do we have our first conscious experience? Not our first memory, but when, is a human being first aware, has any kind of sensations? And I think you might have differing views or the same view. I'm not sure, so I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Well, we know for sure that, insofar as we can ever know that anybody's conscious, that newborn babies can do all the things that we associate with consciousness. They have beliefs, they have desires, they have perceptions, their brains are showing patterns of plasticity and change in the light of experience, and I think anybody who's hung out with a newborn baby has at least as much evidence for the newborn baby being conscious as they do for anybody else being conscious. So, but I think the important point, the point that I would like to make most, is that thinking about that baby consciousness makes you realize that consciousness isn't this kind of unitary thing, as I think people, including philosophers, often think. So we tend to focus on the consciousness, surprise, surprise, of an adult philosopher sitting in his being relevant armchair, and treat that as if that's consciousness, and then the question is, how much of it is there, and can you have more of it, or can you have less of it, or why is it there? And I think thinking about children, as well as animals and other creatures, emphasizes that there's actually many different relationships between experience and function and biology. So I think for sure newborns are conscious, but their consciousness, I think we have reason to believe, is very different, has a very different texture, a very different function, different kinds of brain bases perhaps than the typical adult philosopher sitting armchair consciousness.
Right. And you don't need a sense of self, you don't need language, you don't need any of that, just to have raw basic sensation and experience. But then I guess the further question is sort of how far down the rabbit hole do we go? So, okay, we can be pretty certain that babies have it, but what about, in utero? What about a fetus? At what point does consciousness emerge? Christof, do you have any perspective on that?
No, we don't really know. There's an active discussion in the field about fetal pain. To what extent is a fetus capable of having pain, which is different from just reflexivity. Right. Clearly, they have reflexes, but that's different from having the experience of pain. And so then the arguments here revolve around what you believe is the minimal correlates and structure in the brain that you need. So do you need an EEG that begins to resemble an EEG of a term infant, which typically doesn't happen until 35th week or so post-conception? Or do you need the presence of cortical thalamic circuits, which isn't there until, let's say, week 25, 26, 27? So maybe before that time, it doesn't feel like anything, and then slowly consciousness begins to emerge. It's difficult to know. Also, if you think about the intrauterine environment, it's an anoxic environment. The placenta has all sorts of modulatory factors that are released into the bloodstream, into the brain of the fetus to moderate the neuronal firing. So it's not clear. It doesn't look like it has activity. For instance, there really seems to be a big difference in EEG activity after the baby comes out of the womb compared to, let's say, at week 30. So it's really a difficult thing to know when does consciousness happen. Now, it may be that it happens very, very early on already, that if you have already, the blastocytes with 16 or 32 cells, it begins to feel something, but with such unimaginable little consciousness that really human-level consciousness may only be recognizable around, I don't know, either in the last term or this massive, you've got to remember, it's a massive traumatic event, right, for the fetus. Because it's protected in the womb, it's pretty dark, it's relatively muffled, it doesn't breathe by itself, typically, and now it gets ejected through the birth canal with the birthing process into a world where it has to breathe by itself, where it's, there are all these bright lights and sound. And we know from animal experiments, this is massive, massive surge of noradrenaline and catecholamines, much bigger than any other point in time in life. So maybe this is really a key signal.
But
it's difficult to know.
This is a very biological explanation of why, but if let's say you were going according to IIT, what would it mean? Would it mean that a gamete is conscious? I mean, what would IIT say about when consciousness begins?
Well, again, it's not easy to answer that question. Really depends on the detail. We know from EG the baby has two different states. There's an active state and a passive state, right? And mom can tell you in the third trimester the baby will kick around, right? Which seems to be more like a REM and a non-REM state. So maybe in a REM state it feels like something, and how far that goes back. Look, all your neurons, your progenitor neurons and neurons are in place by the end of the first trimester. But then of course it takes another 4 to 8 weeks for the thalamic input to develop into the cortex. If you think that's really core, what many people believe that's really the core structure associated with consciousness, then there wouldn't be much consciousness to speak of before, let's say, 20 weeks.
Well, I think a general point about the way that our ideas about consciousness have changed, and the IIT is relevant to this, is, there was a time that philosophers argued, for example, that if you didn't have language, you wouldn't be conscious. And I think in general what's happened is the more we've found out, the more we've thought about it, the more general consciousness seems to be. That the idea that there are these sharp dividing lines between the philosopher or armchair consciousness and all the other kinds of consciousness, whether you're talking about what happens in development or whether you're talking about what happens in evolution. So a very similar kind of problem is, at what point in evolution did consciousness emerge? There's the same kind of empirical problems of figuring out how to answer that. But I think what's happened is, as we've thought about it more and found out about it more, that's gotten pushed back so that now.
So where are we at in terms of when consciousness emerged in our evolutionary history?
Yeah, so at least there's several interesting philosophical arguments. Eva Jablonka and Peter Godfrey Smith have argued for this, that the events that happened in the Cambrian explosion, when you suddenly started getting eyes, sensors, and actors, that's kind of the kind of setup that seems to sort of underpin consciousness in general. The idea that you are looking at a world with a certain kind of perspective and acting on that world. But I think, again, it's really important to have this, at least from my perspective, this kind of pluralistic account of consciousness, where the kind of consciousness that would, attend the creatures in the Cambrian, who are still very, very simple, sort of barely have brains, but are starting to connect sensors and actors, might be qualitatively very different. That kind of experience would be qualitatively very different from a creature that has language and self-consciousness and reflection and many things that people have thought of as being relevant to consciousness. So my view is I think the question about is there consciousness or when does consciousness emerge, as if that was a single thing, is misguided. The right way to think about it is, how are various kinds of experience related both in evolution and development to various kinds of underlying function and neuroscience. And there might be completely different stories. I mean, maybe the stories are not even in the same area. Now, I know, Christof, you've argued for this very
I totally disagree.
IIT theory.
Christof, do you think we need a nervous system? What about an amoeba? It can approach and avoid stimuli. I mean,
And as you've said, the IIT, I mean, the funny thing is that unified theories like IIT end up being sort of panpsychic, which is
they share some
kind
of
of saying the same
they
thing.
share some of the panpsychist intuition that many things are unsolved. Yeah, so it is true, as Alison mentioned, there's over the last 150 years this curious inversion happening, where consciousness has been evicted from the upper echelon of the information processing machinery. It used to be, if you look at information processing from the basic data streaming in from your retina and your ears into the immediate level cognition, and consciousness was sitting at the top with planning, with self-knowledge, and with language. This is sort of really a reflection of the Aristotelian idea of a rational soul. But then over the last 100 years, we realized, well, consciousness really experience is much more broadly. If you just have a toothache, if you feel bored, just feeling something, which is different from not feeling anything, that sort of is experience. And that's common through all the different baby experiences and experience of animals in the Precambrian. It feels like something, to adopt the language of Thomas Nagel. If it feels like something to be you, then you are conscious by definition. And then we can ask, well, what does it feel like, and how does what you feel differ from what it feels like to be baby? Those are all interesting ideas. But what's common is it feels like something. Subjectivity, consciousness, sentience, no matter what you call it. And so we, as scientists, are called upon, particularly, I feel as an ex-physicist, that we want some universal explanation. We want an explanation that's valid everywhere in the universe, what does it take for a piece of physical matter, like my brain is, that's subject to all the normal laws of quantum mechanics and relativity, etc. What does it take for a piece of matter to become conscious, and then ultimately become so conscious that it becomes self-conscious, it becomes aware of its own awareness? Now that's typically only in us and in a few other highly evolved species, but I think, and certainly if you look at bees, for instance, I love bees, who doesn't love bees? And they have 1 million neurons. The circuit density is 10 times higher than the density of a cortex. They can recognize individual, they can do delay match to sample. You can train them more quickly with sugar water than you can train a monkey. And so I assume when a bee, is in the sun, warm sun, and it's just, taking some of its nectar, it has some feeling of happiness. Now it doesn't have a voice in a head, presumably, like we have, because it can't talk, but it feels like something to a bee. And so you shouldn't kill bees. You should just sort of shoo them gently away. They also have only one life bookended between 2 eternities, just like all of us have.
Well, I'm not sure an analogy that I think might be relevant. I certainly think that our job is to try and figure out this puzzle about how systems that we know are physical also can have this thing that we also know exists, namely experience. But my suspicion is that and we won't know until we finish doing the science. But there's an interesting historical precedent, which is that in the 19th century, we thought that there was this problem of life. We thought that there was going to be something like an élan vital. There was going to be a single answer to the problem of life, something that told us what something living and non-living was. And people had just as strong intuitions that there was something really foundationally different about living things and non-living things, and that it was universal, that it was something, going back again to Aristotle talking about dhyānama, there's been a very strong intuition that there's this life force, there's chi, there's something that is life. And it turned out that was just not true. That was just the wrong question. We actually have very good explanations, very beautiful scientific explanations of all the phenomena that we think of as life, which include, reproduction and certain kinds of complex behavior. And it turns out there isn't a single reductive answer. It's different in every case. So the relationship between our genetics and our reproduction is a complicated, interesting story. And it's not, Christof, I wanted to argue with you about this when you were talking last night. When people say, we have no idea what the relationship is between experience and functional biology, that's just not true. We have lots of ideas. All of psychophysics and perceptual psychology is about the relationship between experience and function.
That's true. We have massive amount of bridging principles of correlation, yes. We know exactly this part of the brain relates to that sort of perception. We know psychophysics. But what we still lack, look, if you go to the foundational equation of physics or chemistry, biology, nowhere is there consciousness. Yet I wake up, I see you, I obviously have a picture in my head. So the challenge is, how does the picture come into my head?
Well, but the question is,
and maybe it's like life, but maybe not. Maybe it's just fundamentally different.
Maybe a different question to help frame it would be, why did it evolve? If it evolved at all, or maybe you think it's just a fundamental property of the universe like gravity, but if it evolved, why did it evolve? And that might help us answer some of these questions. And also, what about an octopus that had a very different evolutionary history than us? What can that tell us about consciousness as well?
Well, Baba told us that yesterday. Well, so in the strict sense, according to RIT, in the strict sense, consciousness just is. It's just like charge. No physicist asks, well, what's the function of charge? Charge is the property of certain elementary particles. So in principle, the theory says, certain systems have consciousness. However, consciousness is closely tied in order to get high consciousness, you need these systems that really integrate information at massive feedback. Those systems are just, if you do simulated life, so you can do all these experiments where you simulate the creation of artificial creatures in simulated environment, and you can show that creatures that adapt to complex environment, they inherently have a very complex wiring, and that gives rise to a high phi. So it's like an evolutionary spandrel. It's like, your ability to do math or to appreciate music. We didn't evolve to, there wasn't a driver for early evolutionary driver for performing music or for doing math or for consciousness. So the driving function is function, is behavior. If you're conscious, you're smarter, you can plan more, you have more insights, so you survive longer. So in the broad sense, it was selected for by evolution. In the narrow sense, it just is. It's a property of physical systems.
Well, I think there's an interesting piece of history that people haven't paid as much attention to. There's an idea in philosophy called neutral monism, and the idea of neutral monism is that there are properties of the world that are sort of shared by things that we think of as being experience and things that we think of as being physical. And one that I think people don't quite appreciate, for instance, is computation. So if you look at the origin of the theory of computation, our conventional wisdom now is, oh, computers can't ever be conscious. They're not the sort of things that have consciousness. They're not related to consciousness. But our idea about computation actually came from thinking about women in Bletchley Park who were doing computations. And what Turing does is say, here's the absolutely conscious phenomenological experience of doing a computation. You take this number, you add it to that number, you do something else. What would it be like if we instantiated that in a physical system? So already, when you're thinking about the foundations of computation, you already have an idea that integrates information that comes from thinking about phenomenology and information about the physical world. And relevant to what Christof was saying, it turns out, as a scientific discovery, which nobody thought of before Turing, that a system that has the same kind of complexity that is given to us in our experience also is a system that can do things like adapt to environment, perform complex
Well, then the big question is, so if it can do those things, so let's say a non-biological system that has the same computational power, it can behave and do these things, but will it have feeling?
Well, I think that's a question that will come out as we actually do the science to understand what all the relationships are between those kinds of functions and experience. But I think the important thing to say is it's not as if we did a whole bunch of scientific work that led to ideas like computation without ever thinking about experience or phenomenology at all. And then we have this other weird, spooky world, which is our world of phenomenology. Psychophysics, perceptual psychology, computation, all of those integrated ideas about experience and phenomenology and ideas about function from the very beginning. So we already have scientific theories that bridge those. We don't have a big, grand, general theory, but we have lots of specific examples of bridges. And I think an important thing to say as a developmentalist is that I think considering a much wider range of kinds of experience, both in evolution, thinking about what it would be like to be an octopus or what it would be like to be a bee, and even in our everyday experience, thinking about what are, I think, inappropriately called altered states, like what it's like to be a baby or a 3-year-old, or what it's like to be in a meditative state, or what it's like to be in a state after you've taken psychedelics, when basic things like the self, at least in terms of your experience, are disappearing. I think that might be a much better strategy than the strategies that we've typically had of focusing on a relatively narrow range of conscious states. That's a strategy to give us a sense of the breadth of possible relationships between experience and function. And another thing is, I think we're still, this is a point that you were just making, Christof, about the Aristotelian view. In spite of ourselves, we still have very much this kind of ladder of nature view of human beings. That every time we're trying to explain something about human beings, consciousness being a good example, the right way to explain it is we're on top, and everything else, a baby and octopus, is some defective version of us. We're kind of at the top of the pecking order. And I think we have every biological reason to believe that that's just a terrible solipsistic illusion. The right way to think about it is not, oh, how conscious is an octopus? It's what's the experience like for a creature that is adapted to that particular kind of niche. I don't think there's any reason to believe that we have a metric or a ladder about some creatures being more conscious than others.
I think it's different rather than greater.
Yeah.
Well, in principle, if you had a theory like IAT or any other theory, once you have a theory, you can measure things, right? Galileo makes measurable those things that are not measurable today. In principle, you could have a ladder, scalae naturae, as the ancient called it, where in principle you could rate animals, organisms, humans, across species in their level of complexity by, in principle, even a single number. I don't find that inconceivable at all. In fact, integrated information has that. The measure of existence of any system, its irreducibility, defined in precise sense, is a number. It's a pure number. It's not measured in bits and anything. It goes from 0, when the system doesn't exist for itself, to some infinite large number. And in principle, at least, you can take each organism, you can look at its circuitry, you can look at its state transition probability matrix, and you can compute, given the system in this state, what is its phi. And then in principle, you can range them. I know some people sort of inherently sort of recoil from this idea that you can rate that you can rate something as consciousness, but it may well be possible that, yes, indeed, you can measure things precisely like the degree to which a system exists for itself, which is ultimately what consciousness is.
Okay, so then what about the substrate question? So what if we built a neuromorphic computer made of non-biological substance that had the same computing power according to this measure of phi? Would it have feelings?
Yes, so it's a really interesting question. So people assume very widespread in Silicon Valley, and it's a zeitgeist of today. You see it in Her and in Westworld and in Blade Runner and Ex Machina and all these movies, that if we create something that has our function, that performs like us, and that has something called a memory and a working memory and a short-term memory, and speaks like us, etc., this thing will automatically, it has to be. How else could it be? If you give the same input and performs the same output, then of course it has to come. Everything else that comes with the human also comes with this machine. So it's also conscious, because we have that, so the machine have that. I think that intuition is profoundly wrong. It's profoundly dehumanizing also. I think it has to do with, ultimately, you have to look at the innards. You have to look under the hood. You have to actually look at the wiring. And then it turns out you can have two systems that perform functionally exactly the same. You couldn't tell them apart from the outside, let's say using a Turing test. But the one would feel like something, while the other one wouldn't feel like anything.
But Christof, that's contradicting what you just said, right? So when we were talking about evolution, what you said is the reason why you think that phi is a relevant theory is because systems that have this kind of complex structure are going to be systems that can adapt to the environment in certain kinds of ways, right?
On an evolutionary drive, not engineer. I'm talking about the engineered system that don't subject that. Yes, evolved system. It's highly, highly likely that any evolved system has massive amount of feedback, and such a system will have high causal power, intrinsic causal power, and high phi. But if I build systems, I don't have to follow the usual constraint of evolution. I can build whatever my technology allows me to do.
If you had a system that was really indistinguishable from a human being, right? What it would have the property of doing would exactly be to adapt to the environment in the kinds of ways
I can build it. Alexa 20.0, Siri 30.0.
But Christof, the point is that what you would build in order to have the same kinds of properties of adaptation to the environment that, say, a human baby has, right? It's not that a human baby can do all the things.
I don't build it. I simulate. It's all the difference. I simulate it in software.
Wait, I thought a simulation can't be conscious because
that's my point. It's a deep fake. You can simulate humans perfectly in the fullness of time. You can get their sarcasm, you get their irony. Alexa is working on that.
Why do you have any reason to believe that that's true, Christof?
Well, because ultimately we need a theory. We can't just, I agree, we can't just depend on our intuition. We need a theory. The particular theory I've been involved in says quite clear, unless you build a neuromorphic machine, i.e. unless you build a machine whose architecture resembles, at the level of the metal, at the level of the silicon, at the level of the transistor gate, resembles the architecture of the brain, then of course you can get human level consciousness. There's nothing magical about the brain. But on digital computers as built today, whether they're ALUs or TPUs or CPUs or whatever else you have, the causal power is minimal. And furthermore, the causal power doesn't depend on what's being simulated. So you can do your tax return, you can watch a movie, or you can run a human simulation, and it will still feel like almost nothing. You can't simulate, just like you can't simulate gravity, you can't simulate you can simulate a weather storm, but it doesn't get wet inside a computer. You cannot simulate consciousness.
All right, let me ask another question. We'll move off this for a second.
Because we agree to disagree.
So we talked a bit about life and a life force and the origins of life, and consciousness is often very much tied to our concept of what it means to be alive, right? I mean, your book, Christof, is called The Feeling of Life Itself, right? Which is about consciousness. But then it starts getting these really interesting questions, especially now given advances in medicine and new technologies, about when consciousness is there, when it's not, what is death? Recently they've reanimated pigs' brains, right? There's all, these studies where people are in a coma, and then they find out that actually if you do fMRI and you say, imagine playing a game of tennis, imagine walking through your house, they can reliably follow directions just looking at their brain activation. So, at what point, first of all, how do we define death even, and how is that related to consciousness?
We have no fundamental conceptual understanding of death. Throughout history, death used to be simple. You stop breathing, your heart stops beating, you're dead. Okay, then people in the middle, yeah, very obvious. You can, any child can tell a dead person from a live person, used to be. But then in the mid-20th century, we invented ventilators, right? Polio, iron lungs, all of that. So now we can keep somebody indefinite, you know, we can ventilate their lungs and then the heart will start up. And so now we can keep somebody indefinite alive. And so then, you know, there's a Harvard Commission, 1967, et cetera. They redefined death as being either the classical cardiopulmonary criteria or irreversibility of brain function. But now, as you said, there was a recent paper out of Yale in Nature, right, that says, well, maybe irreversibility isn't really quite as irreversible as we thought. So it's really a sort of a shifting boundary. And what it fundamentally means, we just have pragmatic definitions of death, and we have legal definitions of death, but we don't really have a fundamental conceptual, really a truly conceptual definition of what death is, which is a process we're all going to undergo sooner or later.
I mean, I think this is a good example. This is one where development can actually be helpful. So one of the things that we know is a really important conceptual change, two important conceptual changes for children, is that it's interesting, about 6 or 7, they go through this conceptual change where they go from thinking about death as just that you move somewhere else, you know, you end up in the ground, but you could come back, to really thinking about it as this kind of end of the life force, and it's connected with this kind of life force picture of how biology works. And that's when kids start to have existential anxieties about
I only had that at 39.
About death. That's
He's a
when
late
you
bloomer.
realize that, you know, you're not coming back, that kids start to really panic about death. But there's a second phase, which is recognizing that biological systems are actually physical systems, and that death has to do with a bunch of mechanical things that are happening to that physical system. And that's not something that happens kind of outside of science. That was one of the scientific discoveries, this kind of life force picture of how life and death work, that you have a force, it helps you to grow, it makes your arms long, as children would say, and then it goes away and you die, is that's kind of like the default condition, the default view about life. And then it turns out that it's much more complicated than that. And I think very much that that's what the story about consciousness is going to be. And these examples of things like being able to reanimate a brain are good examples of the fact that you don't have a kind of a magic life force or a magic consciousness or a soul that appears or disappears in a unitary way. The story is the interesting story, the scientific story, the story that we can make all sorts of wonderful progress on, and that we don't know very much about now, is the story about how all of these kinds of experience and consciousness are related in very complex ways, much more complex than you could capture in a single metric to our phenomenology and our experience. And I think we're only just starting to scratch the surface of, for instance, how neurotransmitters and chemicals are related to experience.
And which actually leads me to this question of, so in terms of the practical implications or applications in society of consciousness research, what do you have to say about, we're doing all this academic, interesting research, trying to understand the brain in its own sake is worthwhile, but what are some of the sort of societal
Patients
impacts?
like this, for instance, to what extent is a patient in a deep coma? Terry Schiavo, many of you will remember, to what extent is there anybody home? So should you do these tests? Very often you can't do them for pragmatic reasons. You may have read in New Yorker 2 years ago the story of this girl from Oakland who was tracheotomy at age 14, and she was declared clinical death. Her mother sued the hospital. The hospital, under legal counsel, released the corpse. It was technically, by the law of the United States of America, a corpse. Then the mother refused to accept that, and she cared for her daughter for another 4 years in New Jersey, which is a state that allows this. This girl had her fingernail grew, she menstruated, the skin pallor was normal. There wasn't any response from her brain, so was she brain dead but her body still was alive? And is that really possible? Does that make sense? But legally, she was dead. So once again, that shows you we don't have the answers, particularly around death. Sometimes in these extreme cases, and technology is rapidly changing. It's really rapidly changing. And so it's confronting us with these cases where, we don't have any idea right now. And so we need to, so ethical, there's obviously implication. consciousness has deep implications for how we treat animals, right? If we look at animals and how we treat them, for food and for our convenience, is that really the ethical right way? Clinical organoids is another case, right? I know there's several of you here who grow these cerebral organoids, and you probably all saw in the New York Times the article by Carl Zimmer showing these cerebral organoids. They're now advanced enough that they begin to have some electrical signature that begin to resemble prenatal EEG, the spike and birth suppression. Well, let's see if the technology advances another 10 years and we can now grow things that are like cookies. And they have electrical activity in the EEG. Should we be doing this? Does this thing feel like something? So there are all sorts of ethical implications, particularly as our technology rapidly advances. What about brain-machine interfaces? Will they enlarge consciousness? Neuralink wants to do this. How is that going to change us? Can we connect my brain with Alison brain? Will there be a single consciousness? There are all sorts of interesting possibilities here. Should we be doing these?
Yeah, I think there's a different set of applications. Again, things that the people in this room have thought about, which is, in a sense, you could argue that one of the things that we've done is really produce a particular kind of altered state of consciousness, the kind of altered state of consciousness that you have in a school, for example, where you have extremely focused experience on very small parts of the space and a lot of inattentional blindness, a lot of inhibition of other things that are going on. And we just sort of take for granted that inducing that particular altered state through institutions like schools, for example, is the right thing to do, that's the thing that will actually lead to various kinds of cognitive advantages. And I think it will, but I think we're increasingly having a sense that there are other kinds of experience that we could induce, say the kinds of experience that we have in meditation, or the kinds of mystical experiences that people have, or the
so
kinds
you really talk about this in this book, and maybe you can talk more about that lantern
that's
versus
right.
spotlight.
Yeah, so I think that's a nice example of this idea of the kind of diversity and plurality of consciousness. That spotlight kind of consciousness, that consciousness that you get when you're sitting in your armchair focusing, concentrating very hard on trying to solve a particular problem, or when you have a child in a classroom who is being told that that's the thing that they ought to do. The thing that we think of as paying attention is actually just has a particular profile, neurological and functional profile, but it's quite different from the profile of other kinds of consciousness. So if you think about the consciousness of a 3-year-old, for example, I was talking about this, that's a kind of consciousness where much more information is being taken in. There's much more wide-ranging plasticity. There's much less inhibition, focus, meta-reflection, self-consciousness. And I think a really interesting fact that's come from looking at things like meditation, or looking at mystical states, or looking at all these things that people have done as long as human beings have been around, have been inducing this kind of completely opposite state of consciousness, this kind of lantern broad consciousness. And people have had very different ways of having a kind of spiritual technology that would induce this much wider range of states with different kinds of consequences. And at least intuitively, people have felt that inducing this kind of state in adults has functional consequences, but we don't really understand very much about that. We kind of wave our hands at it, or we say, yeah, it's good to go to a retreat and meditate, or you get insight from taking psychedelic drugs or from having mystical experiences, but we don't, even though people have been doing this for as long as there have been people, we know almost nothing about what the mechanisms of that are, or even whether this is all just a grand placebo effect. Maybe this is all just a matter of expectation. But I think that's a really interesting
this is as much as placebo as life itself.
Yeah, right. And of course, placebo effects themselves are real and really interesting technologies that we don't understand very well.
But there is something very pleasurable. There's definitely positive emotions associated with that sort of release of constraints, whether it's via meditation or psychedelic drugs. Or, Christof, you once told me about an experience where you went into this sort of like chamber where you would just float, and there was like sort of
flotation tank, pure experience.
Yeah, pure experience, no experience, or maybe you're getting back to that baby-like kind of mind. But there does seem to be something very pleasurable about that experience for whatever reason.
Well, losing yourself,
that's
right? Like in experience of flow is another case, right? When you're fully immersed in whatever, running or climbing or playing tennis or whatever, and you're perfect, you're performing at the peak of your that you've ever done, and that inner critic is totally gone. We find that, you know, you're doing math, a piece of math, you're completely lost in it. You lost the object-subject distinction. And those are moments of pure joy.
Right.
Why? Well, maybe because that Christof is gone. It's checked out.
And you know, I think there's
And as soon as you think about I'm having a flow experience,
then
it stops.
That's right.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting thought about this, and this has come up in the discussion about psychedelics. So, you know, what people are reporting is the experience, and I think the experience for young children as well, is this experience where there's fewer boundaries, where there's less of a sense that there's a narrative self that's in control, that's controlling the experience, less of a sense that there's a foundational boundary between, you know, this self who's living in here and everything else, both human and natural, that's going on. And one of the things that people report in this very wide range of states is that those barriers sort of disappear, and then you end up having terrible, corny, oh wow, one with everything kind of ways of describing it. But there's a really important metaphysical in the philosophical sense, not the theological sense point here, which is that, of course, that's true. So the true thing, the illusion, the hallucination that we're all under, is that there's this little person inside of our heads who actually is separate from everything else around us and is going around making things happen. That's the illusion. Right. If we're actually thinking about science, that's the hallucination. What the science is telling us is, no, there is a completely general causal relationship between all of these creatures, these organisms that are running around this room, and all the other organisms in the room, and the natural world that's going outside. That's actually accurate. That's actually the truth. And the hallucination is the hallucination that there's a self who's kind of trapped inside of our
Well, yes and no,
bodies.
but also I can never feel what you feel. So there is a thing that conventionally I call Christof. It's just a convention, but that's unique, or that's restricted, constrained to this particular brain. And I can never be you. And even if you're a lover and your bodies interpenetrate, you realize the other person is looking back at you, but it's still the other person, right? It's like Tristan and Isolde. They're trying to overcome in Wagner. They're trying to overcome this separation, this last word, and. They sing it, and Tristan and Isolde, and will forever separate us. That's the tragedy of our life. I can never have your consciousness.
Well,
so in that sense, it is very discrete. It's related to individual systems.
I'm not sure that that's true. I mean, I think that if we're actually thinking about a causal relation, so we're thinking about what is it that shapes the way that my brain works and the way that your brain works, one of the things that we know, and this is both experientially and in terms of our data about caregivers and babies, for example, that's a really good case where in a real sense, not just an experienced sense, the baby's experience is being shaped as much by the caregiver as it is by the internal control of the baby themselves, and vice versa. And I think one of the things that the neuroscience is telling us is that's much more true for all of us than we sort of acknowledge. That, for instance, if I'm telling you a story, this is like work that Uri Hassan and other people have done. Puppy Crumb was talking about some of those examples as well. Or I'm singing a song, or we're both dancing together. Literally what's happening is that our brains are getting entrained one on the other.
All of that is true, but it's still my experience and your experience. Look, you know this. People have an affair for a decade long, and their partner never realizes it, because all you have fundamentally, you have the behavior, you have the eye movements, and you have the voice and what they say. You don't actually, you don't look directly into the mind of another person, because it's a different mind, whether it's an animal mind or a human mind. You can infer. We all share lots of our evolutionary heritage. We all share a lot of the environment we grew up with. I agree, but ultimately, my baby or my partner or my dog is its own conscious entity.
We're unfortunately running out of time, but we've run out of time. But I think that perhaps, while it's true we are these independent individual biological beings with our own personal subjective experience, but I think that perhaps our connection can be enhanced, and it's so important, as we know, with developing brains in babies and their maternal attachment or to any kind of maternal type figure or paternal, but perhaps and we're all looking for connection. One way to work towards that is by letting go of our ego and our sense of self, and opening up the consciousness and getting away from that focused kind of spotlight of attention to a more broad view where we can more easily and better connect with other people in as much as we can, as much as what's biologically possible.
But then as a technologist, of course, we can also think, how can we do this using technology? So for instance, can we build a brain-machine interface that directly links my brain with Heather brains, where at some point, once I increase the bandwidth, again, IIT makes a very clear prediction, at some point, abruptly, if we increase the bandwidth with our brain sufficiently, just like, think about it, it's just like at the corpus callosum connecting my left brain and my right brain. If I do this now artificially between Heather and I, then we will be one mind, will be some sort of amalgamation of Heather Christof. A super mind will have, this super mind will have 2 brains, 4 cortical hemispheres, 4 eyes, 4 legs, etc.
There we go. There's the future.
But we have those all around us. We have libraries, right? We have universities. Those are already serving the function of taking all of those individual brains and consciousness and putting them in a single place. A library is already an example. A social group, a culture. Those are all examples of things that we already have that are those kinds of technologies.
No, they're very different. I will know her mind because there's only one mind then. I don't know her mind. As, if I know of her entire life, I still do not know her mind. Ultimately, I don't know exactly what she feels. I can only infer what she feels by, the way she looks at me, or responds, or blushes, or doesn't blush, or whatever.
Okay, on that note, thank you guys very much for a wonderful conversation.